Mournfield, Episode 3. The Aldrich Collectors, a Mr. Ripper's original. The following is a work of fiction. The Mournfield series is produced by Ripper's Nighttime Tales. What follows is the account of the years between the long, quiet decades when the vessel passed through hands that didn't know what they were holding. Most of them got out. Most is not all.
Not every story begins with grief. Some begin with curiosity. Some begin with greed. Some begin with the specific, low-grade recklessness of a person who has read about something terrible and has decided, in the comfortable distance of not having experienced it personally, that they would have handled it better than the people who didn't survive it. The vessel spent 34 years moving through people like that. Collectors, dealers, enthusiasts, people who acquired it for reasons that had nothing to do with loss and everything to do with the particular human compulsion to own things that carry history, objects that have been somewhere, done something, meant something to someone. The antique trade runs on this compulsion. It is at its core the commerce of other people's stories. The vessel had a story. It had several. What the collectors didn't know, what they couldn't have known, because Paul Greer's pamphlet existed in a box in a closet in a small apartment in western Massachusetts and wouldn't be uploaded to any archive for another 4 decades, was that the story wasn't over. That the thing inside the vessel was not gone, not destroyed, not defeated by a 16-year-old boy's rage in December 1978. It was resting, feeding slowly the way a thing feeds when the primary food source has been removed, and what remains is ambient background grief, low-level sadness, the ordinary human darkness that lives in everyone like a pilot light, small and steady and sufficient to sustain something patient enough to wait for the real meal. It waited through 4 owners. 3 of them got out. 1 didn't. My name is Mr. Rippers. This is Episode 3 of Mournfield. The Aldrich Collectors. 4 chapters, 4 people. 34 years. Pay attention to Chapter 4. That one ends differently. Chapter 1. Vincent Marsh, 1989. Boston, Massachusetts. Vincent Marsh was not a sentimental man. He would have told you this himself, cheerfully, without apology, as a point of professional pride. Sentiment was the enemy of good business, and Vincent's business, the acquisition, restoration, and resale of antique furniture and decorative objects, required a clear eye and a cold assessment, and the specific ability to look at something that had belonged to someone and see only what it was worth to the next person. He was good at his job. He'd been doing it since 1974. Operating out of a converted warehouse space in the south end of Boston that smelled permanently of linseed oil and old wood and the particular dusty sweetness of things that had been somewhere for a long time. He had a good eye, better than good, the kind of eye that finds the thing in the box of junk that everyone else has passed over, that identifies the quality beneath the grime, that knows within 30 seconds of looking at something whether it belongs in a glass case or a dumpster. He found the doll at a regional antique fair in April 1989. It was in a mixed lot, a cardboard box of miscellaneous small items from a Vermont estate, priced as a unit at $60. The box contained a collection of pressed glass, 2 silver napkin rings, a child's shoe, and the doll. The dealer running the table had positioned the box at the back, half under the table, with the energy of someone who has priced something to move and doesn't want to answer questions about it. Vincent crouched and looked at the doll without touching it. The craftsmanship was immediately apparent. Porcelain of this quality, hand-painted with this level of precision, was not common, not in 1989, not at a regional fair in western Massachusetts. He estimated it at somewhere between 1920 and 1945, based on the style of the features and the construction of the cloth body beneath the porcelain head and hands. Restoration potential, minimal, because it needed none. Resale value, considerable, to the right buyer. He bought the lot for $50. After a brief negotiation he won easily because the dealer clearly wanted the box gone. He drove back to Boston. He logged the doll in his inventory. He put it on the shelf in his office, the shelf reserved for items he was considering keeping, which he almost never did but liked to think he might, and he went home. That night, at his kitchen table with a glass of wine and the day's mail, he thought about his mother. This was not unusual. His mother had died in 1985, and he thought about her regularly in the way that people think about their dead, not grief exactly, at this stage more a kind of low-level awareness, an ongoing mental correspondence with someone who was no longer there to receive it. He'd thought about her at odd moments for 4 years, a song, a smell, a particular quality of afternoon light. He thought about her more than usual that night. Nothing triggered it, nothing he could point to. Just her, present in his mind with unusual clarity, her voice, her hands, the specific way she'd set a table with the kind of care that made an ordinary Tuesday dinner feel like an occasion. He didn't connect it to the doll. Why would he? He wasn't sentimental. He was a businessman with a good eye and a cleared inventory and a glass of wine at his kitchen table thinking about his dead mother. Which was a normal thing that normal people did. He thought about her every night for a week. By the end of the second week, the thoughts had taken on a quality he couldn't quite categorize. Not pleasant, not unpleasant, just unusually vivid, unusually specific. Details he hadn't thought about in years, surfacing with the clarity of things freshly experienced. The brand of hand cream she'd used. The particular cadence of her laugh. The way she'd pronounced his name when she was annoyed with him. A slight elongation of the first syllable. A drop in pitch on the second. He called his sister in the third week. They talked for an hour about their mother, longer than they'd talked about her since the funeral. His sister said at the end of the call, "I don't know why, but I've been thinking about her constantly this week too." Vincent didn't say anything about the doll. He didn't connect it. By the end of October, 6 months after the fair, he had lost a significant client due to missed deadlines. His assistant had quit, citing the atmosphere of the office as increasingly uncomfortable without being able to specify what she meant by that. His marriage, which had been strained for 2 years before the doll arrived, and was now in the specific terminal phase where both parties are waiting for the other to say the word neither wants to say first, had moved from strained to something closer to over. He sat in his office on a November evening, alone now, the assistant gone, the phone not ringing the way it used to ring, and looked at the doll on the shelf and felt a profound and sourceless sadness that he'd been feeling for months and had attributed to the marriage, to the business, to the general spiritual condition of a man in his mid-40s who has achieved the things he set out to achieve and found them insufficient. The doll looked back. He didn't hear voices. He didn't see it move. He didn't experience anything that he could have described to anyone as paranormal or disturbing or wrong. He experienced only the steady, gradual erosion of his will, the slow flattening of his professional instincts, the dimming of the clear eye, the cooling of the cold assessment. He became, over those 6 months, less of himself, not dramatically, not noticeably to anyone who saw him only occasionally, but to his sister, who called monthly, something was off. To his ex-wife, they'd finalized things in September. Something had been off for longer than she wanted to think about. He sold the doll in December 1989, not because he understood what it was doing. Because he needed money, the business was struggling, the divorce had been expensive, the holiday season was slow, and the doll was the most valuable single item on his shelf, and a buyer had expressed interest. He sold it for $400 to a man named Gerald Aldrich, who collected antique dolls as a hobby, and had heard about it through the network of dealers and collectors that Vincent moved through professionally. He took the $400 and he didn't look back. Over the following year, things improved. The business recovered. He took on a new assistant. He met a woman at an estate sale of all places, which he considered either ironic or appropriate. He stopped thinking about his mother every single night. He never connected any of it to the doll. This is, in its own way, the most frightening thing about Vincent Marsh's chapter of this story. He never knew. He went through 6 months of steady, invisible consumption, the hollow feeding on his ambient grief, his low-level sadness, the pilot light of loss that every person carries, and came out the other side diminished in ways he would never be able to quantify or source. He lived well into his 70s. He was, by all accounts of the people who knew him, a decent man. A little sad around the eyes, maybe. A little careful with his feelings. He never bought another doll. Chapter 2. Gerald Aldrich, 1989 to 1997. Fairfield County, Connecticut. Gerald Aldrich was the kind of man who read about things carefully before acquiring them. He was a retired insurance actuary, a profession that had shaped him in the specific way that professions do when you practice them long enough, which is to say he approached most things in life as risk assessments. What is the probability of this outcome? What are the variables? What are the known unknowns? He was not a fearful man. He was a precise one. These are related qualities and they are not the same. He collected antique dolls because his wife Patricia had collected them before she died in 1984, and he had inherited the collection along with the house and the Connecticut solitude and the specific ongoing project of a widower learning to exist in spaces that used to contain two people. He hadn't added to the collection in 5 years when he heard about the doll through the dealer network. He bought it because the craftsmanship was exceptional. He could see that from the photographs the dealer sent, and because the provenance was interesting, and because he had a gap on the third shelf of the display case in his study that had been bothering him for reasons he found slightly irrational and therefore paid close attention to. He was a risk assessor. He knew when something irrational was worth examining. The doll arrived in January 1990, packed carefully in foam and tissue. Gerald unpacked it at his kitchen table, examined it under good light, confirmed his assessment of the craftsmanship, noted several details of the construction that suggested the cloth body had been rebuilt at some point. The stitching on the torso was significantly newer than the porcelain, and placed it on the third shelf of the display case. The gap was filled. He felt, putting it in place, a satisfaction that was slightly out of proportion to the act of filling a gap in a display case. He noted this, filed it. He began keeping a journal 2 weeks after the doll arrived. This was not new behavior. Gerald had kept journals intermittently for decades. But the January 1990 journal was different from his previous journals in a way that becomes apparent when you read them in sequence, which I have done, because Gerald's niece donated his papers to a university archive in 2015, and the relevant volumes are available to researchers. The previous journals were precise. Clinical. The documentation of a risk assessor, weather, appointments, financial notes, observations about the garden. Patricia appeared frequently in the earlier volumes, noted with the same precision. Patricia's appointment at 3. Patricia not sleeping well. Patricia's laugh at dinner when I burned the rice. The January 1990 journal began with the same tone and shifted, gradually, over the first 3 months, into something else. He began documenting the doll with increasing attention. Not obsessively, nothing so dramatic, just a growing specificity, a narrowing of focus, a sense that the doll was becoming the organizing principle of his note-taking, in the way that Patricia had been the organizing principle of his earlier journals. He noted its position in the case. He noted when the light hit it differently at different times of day. He noted in March that it seemed to him, and he flagged this notation with a parenthetical, irrational, note for review, that the expression on its face was not constant. That some days it looked different than other days. Not different in a way he could photograph and compare. Different in the way that a person's face looks different when their mood has changed, the same features, differently weighted. He noted this. He did not panic. He assessed. In April he wrote, "The doll is interesting. I have been trying to determine why it is interesting in the way that it is, which is different from the way that the other pieces in the collection are interesting." Patricia would have known immediately. She had an instinct for objects, for the history in them, the residue of whatever they'd been through. I have data. She had intuition. I have been thinking about her more than usual this month. This may be connected to the acquisition. Objects associated with grief or loss may activate grief memory. Note for review. Gerald Aldrich, the risk assessor, the precise man. The widower who had built a methodology for existing in a house that used to contain two people, had identified the mechanism and cataloged it correctly, and still couldn't get out of his own way. Because knowing something intellectually and knowing it in the place where it actually operates are two different kinds of knowing. He knew the doll was activating his grief for Patricia. He did not know that something inside the doll was feeding on that activation. Deliberately, carefully, with the patience of something that had been doing this since 1947, and had become very good at pacing itself. It was being careful with Gerald. Measured. He was a risk assessor, too much, too fast, and he would identify the threat and act on it. The Hollow had learned this. Had adjusted. Was feeding at a rate just below his threshold for alarm. This is, I want to note, genuinely terrifying. The thing inside the doll was not operating on instinct. It was operating on strategy. Gerald's journals from 1991 through 1994 document a man in gradual, unalarmed decline. The garden fell behind. Social appointments reduced. The precise clinical tone of his note-taking softened into something more ruminative, more emotional, occasionally repetitive in a way that the Gerald of 1989 would have flagged immediately as cognitive drift. He thought about Patricia every night. He talked to her. Sometimes. Not to the doll. Gerald was too precise for that, too aware of the category error involved in speaking to an object as though it could respond. He talked to the room, to the house, to the specific quality of silence that Patricia had left behind. He would stand in the kitchen, where they'd cooked together for 30 years, and tell her about his day. The doll in the study listened. In 1995, Gerald found the reference. He'd been doing research on antique doll craftsmanship provenance research, which he approached with the same methodology he'd applied to everything in his professional life, and came across the paranormal journal from 1952 that Paul Greer had also found. The mention of the Mournfield Circle, the Vermont Spiritualist Group, the distressing circumstances of 1947. Gerald cross-referenced, filed, assessed. He was a risk assessor. He knew how to read between the lines of carefully worded documentation. He knew that distressing circumstances in a 1952 paranormal journal meant something that someone had decided not to say directly. He knew that the physical description of the vessel, porcelain, dark-haired, unusual eyes, matched the doll in his display case with a specificity that eliminated coincidence as a reasonable variable. He wrote in his journal, "If the Mournfield account is accurate, and I have no basis for concluding it is not, the object in my collection may be significantly more than an antique. The question is not what it is, the question is what it wants, and whether what it wants is something I have been providing." He sat with this for a week. Then he wrote, "I think about Patricia every night. I have thought about Patricia every night since January 1990. Prior to January 1990, I thought about her regularly but not nightly. Grief follows a declining curve in most cases, interrupted by anniversaries and sensory triggers. A 6-year sustained plateau is not consistent with natural grief progression. Something has been sustaining it." He looked at the doll in its case for a long time. "It isn't doing anything," he wrote. "That's the problem. I keep waiting for it to do something and it just sits there, and I think about my mother every single night now, and she's been dead for 20 years and I don't know why." He had switched without noticing from Patricia to his mother. He noticed, reviewing the journal entry the following morning, that he'd made the error. This frightened him more than anything else in 8 years of quiet, careful, methodical consumption, that his own documentation had slipped, that the precise man had written one thing while meaning another, that the filing system was beginning to fail. He called a dealer in Boston and sold the doll the following week. He asked no premium. He wanted it gone. He accepted whatever was offered without negotiation, which the dealer noted later as extremely out of character for Gerald Aldrich, who was famously difficult to negotiate against. He wrote one final entry about the doll on the day it left gone. "Whatever it was, whatever it wanted, I hope the distance is sufficient. I have lost 8 years to it. 8 years of Patricia, 8 years of my mother, 8 years of grief I had processed and was carrying competently and found, this morning, to be as raw as 1984. I did not grieve for 8 years. I was farmed." Note for anyone who finds these journals: if you encounter an object that makes you think about your dead, with unusual consistency and unusual vividness, get rid of it. Not because it is supernatural, because it is a drain. Whatever it is, however it works. Some objects are drains. This one is a drain shaped like a child, and it is very good at what it does. "I am going to call my sister." He called his sister. She came for the weekend. They talked about their mother for the first time in years, real talking, the kind that costs something, not the polished anecdote versions but the actual material. Gerald died in 2009. His journals ended up in a university archive in 2015. A graduate student digitized them for a project on grief and material culture and uploaded the relevant volumes to a research database where, several years later, they would be found by someone doing research for a pamphlet they were planning to annotate. Gerald never knew his documentation would matter. It mattered. Chapter 3. Susan Vell, 2011-2014. Burlington, Vermont. Susan Vell did not want the doll. This is the important thing to establish first. Because Susan's chapter is different from the others. Different from Vincent's slow erosion. Different from Gerald's methodical consumption. Susan had no grief to speak of. No recent loss. No dead mother. No dead wife. No war in her past. She was 44 years old, she worked in hospital administration, she had 2 adult children she was on good terms with, and an ex-husband she was on acceptable terms with, and a life that was, by her own assessment, reasonably functional, and occasionally even pleasant. She inherited the doll from Gerald Aldrich's estate. Gerald was her great-uncle. She hadn't known him well. He was a Connecticut relative, the kind that appeared at Christmas and funerals and otherwise existed as a voice on the phone twice a year. When he died in 2009, she didn't expect to be in the will. When the executor called to tell her she'd been left a box of items from Gerald's study, she assumed it was books, or financial documents, or the kind of miscellaneous accumulation that ends up in the wills of solitary, precise men who have outlived most of the people they intended to leave things to. She picked up the box 2 years after Gerald's death, 2011, when she finally made the trip to Connecticut to settle the remaining estate matters. The executor handed her the box with the specific neutral expression of someone who has been managing this particular item for 2 years and is relieved to see it leave. She didn't open the box until she got home to Burlington. Inside, 3 of Gerald's journals, a photograph of Patricia, a letter addressed to Susan in Gerald's handwriting that she read twice and then put in a drawer, and the doll. The letter said, in its entirety, "I am leaving you this object because you are the most sensible person in this family, and because I do not trust anyone else to handle it correctly. Handle it correctly means this: do not keep it, do not sell it to anyone who is grieving. If possible, destroy it, though I was unable to accomplish this myself. If you cannot destroy it, put it somewhere no one will find it for a long time. I am sorry to leave you with this. I don't know what else to do with it. Read the journals. Gerald." Susan read the journals. She was a hospital administrator. She dealt, professionally, with the intersection of human suffering and institutional process. She had a high tolerance for uncomfortable information and a well-developed ability to assess situations without emotional interference. She read Gerald's journals with the same attention she brought to difficult budget reviews, carefully, completely, without skipping the parts she didn't want to read. She put the doll on the shelf in the spare room and closed the door. Her plan was simple. She would research methods of destruction over the following month. She would apply the most promising method. If it failed, she would find a containment solution, something more permanent than a shelf in a spare room, somewhere the ambient population of grieving people was as low as possible. It was a good plan, sensible, practical, appropriately cautious. What Susan had not accounted for was the spare room. The spare room was where she'd put her daughter Emma's things when Emma moved out 2 years earlier. Boxes of childhood belongings, packed carefully, stored for the eventually we'll sort this out conversation that had not yet happened. Nothing dramatic. Emma was alive and well and living in Portland. They talked twice a week. There was no grief in the spare room. Except Emma had been born premature. 28 weeks. Which in 1990 was survivable but not easily. Not without a 6-week NICU stay and a series of complications that had resolved completely and left no lasting damage, and had also been the 6 worst weeks of Susan Vell's life. Emma was fine. Emma had always been fine. Susan had processed the fear of those 6 weeks and stored it appropriately and moved on, which was what you did when the outcome was good and there was no ongoing reason for the fear to be active. The doll, on the shelf in the spare room, found the storage unit. Not dramatically. Not overnight. Over 3 years, so gradually that Susan, a hospital administrator with a high tolerance for uncomfortable information, didn't recognize the pattern until she was well inside it. She started dreaming about the NICU. Specific dreams, detailed and sensory, the kind that leave residue on waking, the smell of the ward, the sound of the monitors, the specific weight of a 28-week baby in her hands, too small, too fragile, the terror of loving something that the universe had not yet committed to keeping. Emma was 31 years old. She was fine. She lived in Portland and called twice a week and was, by every available measure, completely fine. Susan's hands shook sometimes when she picked up the phone to call her. She increased her visits to the spare room, gradually, without consciously intending to, going in to get things that didn't need getting, standing among Emma's childhood boxes in a way she couldn't explain if anyone had asked, which nobody did because Susan lived alone. In the 2nd year, she started calling Emma more. Emma, who loved her mother and was perceptive in the specific way of adult children who have watched their parents closely for 3 decades, noticed the increase in calls and the new quality in her mother's voice, something slightly elevated, slightly urgent, something that wanted reassurance without being able to ask for it directly, and asked, on a call in early 2013, "Mom, are you okay?" "I'm fine," Susan said. "I just like talking to you." This was true. It was also the Hollows' work, and they were the same thing, and that combination, the genuine and the manipulated being identical and indistinguishable, is perhaps the most insidious thing about this particular entity. It doesn't fabricate, it amplifies. It takes what is real and turns up the volume until the signal overwhelms everything else. Susan loved her daughter. The hollow made her love her daughter like a wound. In 2013, she began calling Emma by a name she'd used only in the NICU, a private name, a whispered thing, the name you give something too fragile for its real name, before you're certain the universe is going to let you keep it. She caught herself mid-call and stopped and sat with the phone against her chest for a long time. She went to the spare room. She stood in front of the shelf where the doll sat and looked at it with the clear eyes of a woman who had read Gerald's journals 3 years ago and had been living with his conclusions without fully accepting them, the way intelligent people sometimes live with correct conclusions that are too uncomfortable to fully accept. The doll looked back. "I know what you're doing," she said. The doll did nothing. Sat on its shelf among Emma's childhood boxes and did nothing, the way it had been doing nothing for 3 years while feeding at the slow, careful rate that it had learned was appropriate for a sensible woman with no fresh grief and a high tolerance for uncomfortable information. Susan picked up the doll. She carried it outside. She put it in the metal garbage can in the alley behind her building, and she went back inside, and she did not go back out. At 3 a.m., she woke from a dream in which Emma was in the NICU again, the monitors alarming, the nurses moving fast, woke with her heart hammering, and her hands already reaching for the phone, and the absolute certainty, the bone-deep, irrational certainty, that something was wrong with her daughter right now. Tonight, she needed to call. She put the phone down. She sat on the edge of the bed in the dark and breathed and told herself, Emma is 31 years old and she lives in Portland and she is fine. And that feeling is not real. It is a feeling the doll produces. It is hunger wearing the shape of your fear. And Emma is fine. She called Emma in the morning. Emma was fine. They talked for an hour. Susan went to the alley. The garbage can was empty. Pickup had been overnight. She stood in the alley in the early morning light and felt relief so complete it nearly knocked her over. She called Emma again that evening, and the next morning, and the morning after that, and gradually, over weeks and then months, the calls settled back to twice a week. The dream stopped, her hands steadied. She didn't know where the garbage truck had taken it. She thought about that sometimes, in the way you think about a problem you've passed to someone else without their knowledge. She hoped it ended up somewhere inert, a landfill, a compactor, somewhere far from anyone with a hole in their chest where someone used to be. It didn't. It ended up in a municipal surplus auction in early 2014. A man named Derek Poole bought a box lot of miscellaneous items for $15. He was furnishing a new apartment. He'd recently separated from his wife. He put the doll on a shelf in his living room, without looking at it closely. 3 months later, distracted and sleep-deprived and running on guilt and coffee, and the specific unraveling of a man whose life is coming apart at every seam, he ran a red light. Chapter 4. Derek Poole, 2014-2024, Springfield, Massachusetts. I want to be careful here. Derek Poole killed a child. He ran a red light at 4:17 p.m. on a Wednesday afternoon, and he killed Lily Harper, who was 8 years old and liked strawberry shampoo, and kept her cereal bowl with the cartoon rabbit, because she'd had it since she was 3, and didn't see any reason to give up the things she liked. I want to be careful, because it would be easy, and wrong, to use what came after as mitigation. As though what the Hollow did to Derek Poole in the 10 years before the accident, and in the months after, was a kind of excuse. It wasn't. The Hollow didn't steer his car. Derek Poole ran a red light because he was distracted and sleep-deprived, and had been both of those things for months, and Lily Harper died because of it. What the Hollow did is its own thing. Separate. Documented here not as mitigation but as information. As the missing chapter of the vessel's history that connects the antique fair in 1989 to the brown box on the Harper porch in 2024. Derek Poole was 38 years old when he bought the box lot at the municipal auction. He was, by his own later account, given to a therapist he started seeing after the separation, a man who had never properly processed anything. His father had died when Derek was 12. His mother had remarried quickly, unhappily. He'd carried the father-shaped loss around for 26 years, in the same way that Frank Greer had carried Chosin, compressed, sealed, unfiled. The Hollow found it within the first week. Unlike the measured approach it had taken with Gerald Aldrich, the slow, below-threshold feed of a strategist adjusting to a precise man, it consumed Derek with an urgency that suggests something about its condition after 3 years with Susan Vell. It was hungry. 3 years of slow, carefully rationed feeding on a sensible woman with no fresh grief had left it depleted in some way that made it less patient, less measured, more willing to push. Derek started dreaming about his father immediately, not the gradual escalation of Vincent's nightly thoughts or Gerald's sustained plateau, immediate, intense, the first night. His father, who had died of a heart attack when Derek was 12, present in the dreams with the full vivid weight of someone still living, talking to him, looking at him the way fathers look at sons they're proud of. Derek woke from the first dream and cried for an hour. He hadn't cried about his father since the funeral, which he'd been too young and too shocked to cry at properly, which meant 26 years of unfiled grief, and the Hollow had found all of it within 24 hours and opened every drawer. He called his mother. She didn't understand why he was calling, which was fair, because he didn't understand either. He told her he'd been thinking about Dad. She was uncomfortable. His mother had never been comfortable with emotional conversations, and changed the subject, and he hung up feeling worse than before he'd called. He talked to the doll. Not in the deliberate, nightly way that Helen Greer had talked to it. Not in the organized conversational sessions that Dana Harper would conduct years later. Informally, in passing, the way you talk to a pet or a photograph, a comment made while passing through the room, a question asked without expecting an answer, the gradual accumulation of small emotional deposits that the Hollow collected with the efficiency of a very patient bank. It answered him. Rarely at first. Quiet enough to be deniable. A shift in the room's atmosphere. A sense of presence that could be attributed to grief or loneliness or the general strangeness of living alone for the first time in a decade. Then more clearly, sounds. A voice, heard at the threshold of sleep, saying things that felt like comfort and landed like a hook. Derek, who had no Paul Greer's rage, no Gerald Aldrich's methodology, no Susan Vell's clear eyes and high tolerance for uncomfortable information. Derek Poole had nothing to put between himself and the Hollow except a loneliness so total it had become structural. He gave it everything. He became, over 10 years, a man who was diminished in every direction simultaneously. His social connections narrowed, his concentration failed. He lost the apartment, found a cheaper one, lost that, found a room. He held jobs for shorter and shorter periods, not because he was incompetent, but because the part of him that could sustain professional engagement was being steadily consumed, redirected toward the nightly conversations with something that answered in his dead father's voice, and gave him just enough to keep coming back. His wife's divorce filing, in 2019, included a declaration from her therapist describing Derek as emotionally unreachable, appearing to live primarily in an interior world disconnected from external relationships and responsibilities. She was not wrong. The interior world in question had been furnished by the Hollow over 5 years, using his father's residue as raw material, and Derek had moved into it so completely that the exterior world, the actual world, the one with consequences and people and red lights at intersections, had receded to the status of inconvenience. He ran the red light on a Wednesday afternoon in October 2024. He survived the accident with minor injuries. He was charged. He was released on bail. He went home to his room and he sat with the doll, and he understood, in the specific way of someone who has been living in a manufactured reality and has just experienced something too large and too real to be absorbed by it, that the floor had given way. Lily Harper was dead. He had killed her. This was real in a way that nothing had been real for years, and the realness of it was more than the interior world the Hollow had built could contain. He did not sleep for 4 days. On the 5th night, exhausted beyond the body's capacity for sustained wakefulness, he sat with the doll in his room and felt the Hollow reach for him the way it always reached. The warmth, the comfort, the specific manufactured piece of a thing that had been managing him for a decade. And he understood for the first time what it was. Not his father, never his father. Something wearing his father's voice built from his own grief, feeding on the decade of conversations, growing stronger on the guilt that was now vast and fresh and entirely unmanageable. "You've been using me," he said. The doll said nothing. "My whole life. Everything since 2014. His voice was flat. Not Paul Greer's rage. Derek Poole was too depleted for rage. Just the flat, exhausted recognition of a man who has understood something too late. "I gave you everything. You took everything. And you're going to take this too. This guilt. What I did. You're going to feed on this too. The room was very quiet. I don't have anything left, he said. There's nothing left to take. He was wrong about that. There was one thing left. The Hollow had been waiting for it since the accident. It reached for the grief. Not his father's grief, the fresh grief. The specific, raw, unprocessed horror of having taken a child's life. The guilt that had no floor, no bottom. The kind of guilt that a person could drown in without ever touching ground. Derek Poole let it. He was found 2 days later. The neighbor had called it in. He was sitting in his chair, the doll in his lap, both hands folded, eyes open. The medical examiner listed it as cardiac event. No signs of foul play. He had been dead for approximately 48 hours. He was 48 years old. The doll sat in his room, uncollected, while the case was processed. It sat there through the police documentation, through the removal of the body, through the 2 weeks it took for the next of kin to be notified and the room to be cleared. During those 2 weeks, it worked. I don't know the mechanism. I don't know what it does in the intervals between families, in the empty rooms, with no grief to feed on, and no living person to manipulate. I know only the result. When Derek Poole's room was cleared, a box was found packed and addressed. Brown cardboard. The Harper family's name and address in careful, old-fashioned handwriting. A postage label applied correctly. Stamped, ready to mail. The mail carrier picked it up on a Wednesday. It arrived on a Thursday. Dana Harper found it on her porch on a Wednesday morning of the 6th week of her grief, her coffee going cold in her hand, and opened it and found, wrapped in yellowed tissue paper, a doll that looked exactly like her daughter. And the story that Paul Greer started. The story that Gerald Aldrich documented. The story that Susan Vell interrupted and Derek Poole could not continued. Interlude. What the years did, before the closing, I want to account for the time. 34 years. 4 people. And in between the people, the intervals. The auction house storage. The shipping boxes. The moments of transit when the vessel moved from one set of hands to another. What does it do in the intervals? Paul Greer believed it rested. That dormancy was possible. That the absence of grief reduced it to something close to inert. Gerald Aldrich's journals suggest something more active. That it operates at different intensities depending on the available material. Not dormant but subsisting. The way a fire subsists on green wood rather than dry. Burning lower and slower, but never going out. I think Gerald was right. I think it was never not working. I think it found something in every person who touched it. Every appraiser who handled it at the fair. Every person who walked through Gerald Aldrich's study and paused at the display case and felt something they couldn't name. A pull, a mild, inexplicable sadness, a sudden thought about someone they'd lost. It was always feeding, always patient, always waiting for the meal that was worth the wait. Derek Poole was the bridge. 10 years of consumption, a decade of manufactured intimacy, all of it building toward the accident and the guilt and the access it provided to a family, fractured at exactly the right angle. The Harpers were the meal. You know how that ended. What you don't know yet, what this series will document, episode by episode, going backward through the decades and forward through whatever comes next, is whether the ending the Harpers found is permanent. Susan Vell put it in a garbage can. It ended up at an auction. Dana Harper left the fragments in Lily's chair. Something turned up in the back of the closet, wrapped in yellowed tissue paper, smelling like strawberry shampoo. Dana carried it outside, left it in the open air, came back inside and made coffee, and told the crust story and let it mean what it meant. In the morning it was gone. I've been asking since I first assembled this account whether gone means gone. Whether a thing that has been moving through grieving families since 1947, that has survived Paul Greer's rage and Gerald Aldrich's precision and Susan Vell's clear eyes and Derek Poole's emptiness, can be stopped by a mother sitting in the grass talking about her daughter's feelings about bread crusts. I think the answer is not stopped, not destroyed, but interrupted. And sometimes interrupted is the best you get. Sometimes interrupted is enough. In closing, 4 people. 34 years. Vincent Marsh, who never knew what hit him. Gerald Aldrich, who figured it out 8 years too late and documented every step of the way so that someone else might not have to. Susan Vell, who read the documentation and acted on it and still spent 3 years being slowly farmed before she got it out of her house. Derek Poole, who had nothing left to fight with, and was consumed so completely that the Hollow used his address as a return label. These are not ghost stories. There are no ghosts here. The dead in this series, Marta Greer, Patricia Aldrich, Frank Marsh's mother, Derek Poole's father, Lily Harper, are gone. Truly, completely, irreversibly gone, the way the dead are gone, which is entirely and without exception and without the consolation of continuation in any form we'd recognize. What the Hollow offers is not connection to the dead. It is a performance of connection, assembled from your own memory, powered by your own grief, running on the specific vulnerability of people who love enough to break when the thing they love is taken. It uses love as a door. This is why Gerald Aldrich's note matters. Some objects are drains. He wasn't being metaphorical, he was being precise, in the way he was precise about everything, right up to the end. The vessel is a drain. It takes the energy of grief, which is the energy of love with nowhere to go, and redirects it into itself. The only counter is love with somewhere to go. The Harpers told each other true things. Paul Greer sat with his family at dinner and let his father talk about Marta's smooth rocks. Gerald called his sister. Susan called Emma every morning for 3 months until the calls became what they were supposed to be. Not reassurance, not the feeding of an amplified fear, but just a mother and a daughter talking because they wanted to. The counter is always the same thing the Hollow cannot replicate, cannot absorb, cannot turn into food. Real connection, the kind you offer without needing anything back.
I'm Mr. Rippers. Episode 4 of Mournfield takes us to 1962. To a family in rural Vermont, a farmhouse, a Korea veteran named Harold Voss who built his grief into a wall so thick he didn't know the Hollow had found the crack until it was almost too late. Almost. Stay strange, stay sharp, and keep your lights on. Not because it helps, because you deserve to see what's in the room with you. I'm Mr. Rippers. Episode 4 of Mournfield takes us to 1962. To a family in rural Vermont, a farmhouse, a Korea veteran named Harold Voss who built his grief into a wall so thick he didn't know the hollow had found the crack until it was almost too late. Almost. Stay strange, stay sharp, and keep your lights on. Not because it helps, because you deserve to see what's in the room with you.